what I thought we would do is I would provide some brief context and sort of the background or the what's happening in the world with Christians at this point, which is something that all of the apologists of the second century are addressing either explicitly or implicitly. And, and then we can break up into breakout rooms and have probably about a 15-minute discussion. I'll put some questions in the chat window that we, and then we'll get back together here or together. Each group should select a moderator who sort of summarizes the results of the discussion. And then we'll simply discuss Aristides, what was discussed in the groups, and then whatever else seems to be. So to begin with, the church Christianity is not legal. It's not a legal religion at this point. It doesn't become accepted until Constantine, and it doesn't become the official religion of the church until afterwards. So that happens in the 4th century. So we're still 2 centuries away from that. So the church is illegal, and the church is often persecuted. Persecutions tend largely to be local. Some official or by popular demand, Christians in a particular area end up being persecuted. There are a few empire-wide persecutions, chiefly under Domitian and Decian in the 3rd century. But largely they tend to be local. Nevertheless, a large number of Christians are martyred during this period. So one of the things is that Christians were not viewed very favorably in society as a whole. So they were considered to be atheists because they didn't believe in a recognized God. They didn't believe in the Greek gods, nor did they believe from one of the traditional religions. So for example, Yahweh. So Yahweh, for example, was the God of Judaism was an established God, and Judaism was recognized as an approved or a sanctioned religion. That was true of most of the religions of the peoples conquered in the Roman Empire and incorporated in the Roman Empire. But Christians were considered atheists because they refused to worship the gods of the empire, and especially the Greek gods. And at this point, the Caesars, starting with Augustus, were also recognized as themselves being gods. And so Christians also refused to recognize the emperor as God. So practicing an unauthorized religion and refusing to recognize or worship the emperor and the official gods, the Greek gods, made them enemies of the state and its institutions. So in terms of the sort of essence of pagan religion is probably really well expressed or best expressed by a line in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, like flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. So the gods are seen as capricious, they're seen as arbitrary, possibly mischievous, more likely malevolent, and so you have to please them. That's also reflected in when Jesus is doing his critique in St. Matthew's Gospel of prayer. He criticizes the Pharisees for wanting to be seen, so that they are effectively praying to, or effectively they're not praying, they're acting. But pagans he accuses of babbling, and they babble because there are a lot of gods. Their intention is largely anywhere, ranges from indifferent to malevolent to maybe beneficial or benevolent. You have to come up with the right set of words to appeal to the right God so that they bless you rather than destroy you. And so the result is that you babble, since the whole thing, you don't really know how the whole thing works, and you have to find the right words to appeal to the right God. So Jesus' critique that they babble, on the one hand, sounds very almost humorous, but it's not. Pagan prayer does indeed consist of babbling. So the point is that here we have Christians are thought to be atheists, and that means that they're likely to bring down the displeasure of the gods, either locally or on the empire as a whole. So Christians were accused of being atheists. They were also accused of being cannibals. Guess why?
Oh,
yeah. The communion.
Right, right, because of the Eucharist. So they were accused of eating the flesh of previously slaughtered infants, sometimes sprinkled with flour. And the Christianity had an enormous appeal to the dispossessed, to the marginalized, to the poor, to women, to slaves. And so Christians were also seen as largely being a set of criminals and scoundrels and people who were of no value at all to society. So Christianity was a religion of the dregs of society. So that sort of provides the context within which all of the apologists of the 2nd century are working. So let's break up into groups. These are the questions discussed in the breakout rooms, and the ensuing discussion once the breakout rooms end and everyone returns to our main session are the questions that we'll discuss throughout the course of this class. The apology is addressed to the emperor.
Emperor.
Yeah, so it's addressed to either, so there's some dispute. According to Eusebius, who was the author of the first church history, it was Emperor Hadrian.
Oh, okay, that's, yeah.
But there are some problems with that. The first heading, the title of the work names Hadrian, but the greeting lists Antoninus Pius. I think it says Hadrianus Antoninus Pius. Antoninus Pius is Hadrian's successor and Hadrian's adopted son. So Eusebius dates the letter, the Apology, at 125, which is when Hadrian was in Athens. But if the Apology was directed at Antoninus Pius, then it was probably written at in about 140, so a 15-year difference. So, but he's more than writing to the emperor. He's writing to the emperor as a philosopher. And that's really, and so implicitly then, he's also writing, so his work was according to Eusebius, fairly widely known in the 2nd and 3rd and early 4th centuries. So that suggests that he was right, and this is also, the 3rd and the 4th century is also the period that systematic theology began to develop. So there was a move from biblical theology, which uses the Bible only as a basis of theology, to systematic theology, which combines the Bible along with philosophy. So besides the emperor, his audience is also any philosopher. And so that molds in some ways the way in which he argues and what he argues about. So how did his intended audience influence his argument? Because there's a very close relationship between, and especially writing to the emperor, but also writing to any philosopher.
Well, we kind of said that it was very idealistic and aspirational and very logical.
Idealistic in terms of his portrayal of Christians.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, let's discuss that next.
Oh, sorry.
Because large parts aren't, idealistic. His critique of Egyptian religion is pretty brutal. His so why does he? So we mentioned that the Egyptians are not one of the races, right? They're barbarians, Greeks. Why does he drag in Egyptians without including them as one of the 4 races earlier?
I think he thinks
Why
they're
might that?
lower.
Maybe they're close to the barbarian. Close, I mean, there's a similarity.
Now he considers them even beneath the barbarians.
Oh, really?
But,
Because they worship plants.
but why does he do that?
Didn't want
Why
anybody to kill him.
why does he include them? Does anyone have any ideas?
He was playing it safe.
Yes, he was playing it safe. What it's safe about?
He didn't want to be slaughtered, killed.
Right, he doesn't want to be slaughtered and killed. Why not? I mean, why would he be slaughtered and killed?
Because he's putting them at the bottom of the
There's
of creation.
Because
That's a lot of
Well,
bad things.
why might that save him from being slaughtered and killed?
he's saying things the king might not want to hear, but he might
Yes.
accept those things.
Exactly.
because the king possibly fit into more than one of those categories, or at least one of the four races. And then if he's critiquing all those other races, that is a critique of, or a criticism of the emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very organized philosophical argument that he presents in the same way, the same language for each of the four, well, each of the groups he critiques. He's presenting his arguments in a very formalized order and builds up to the point, the peak at the end, that if these are gods, how can they be? Because they're acting like the earth, wind, water, and fire, or the elements that God would have made. And then therefore they're not God because they're acting like those elements.
Uh-huh. Right, so he's writing to the emperor as emperor and philosopher. So for some context, Hadrian, I guess you could say, was an amateur philosopher. Antoninus Pius was a patron of philosophy, so he supported philosophers. He was very active in doing that. And his son, who succeeded him, Marcus Aurelius, was an established philosopher. So there's, all three emperors, or at least the two who were the possible recipients of the apology, are familiar with philosophy. So, but they're also the emperor, right? And they're the Roman emperor, and in a period of the Hellenization of the empire. So they believe in the Greek gods. Antoninus Pius had Hadrian, his adoptive father, declared as God
Oh, wow.
by the Senate. So you have this kind of, so you're writing a philosophical or partly philosophical letter to the emperor, who has something of a split personality, right? On the one hand, he's a philosopher and is familiar with philosophy. And on the other hand, he's the Roman emperor who necessarily observes Greek religion in a period when it's believed that the emperor is God. So Aristides begins with there's only one true God, right? And then look at all of these religions with their look at the four races, and two of the four are wildly inaccurate in their understanding of who God is. One comes closer, but still diverges from the truth. And finally, Christianity comes closest of all. So why does he throw in Egyptians? Because their comic relief that tends to divert from the fact that what he's saying is potentially offensive. So it's a way to throw in something that in all likelihood the emperor is going to agree with completely, is going to like, and is going to sort of divert him from the fact that some of this stuff has really made him very angry.
It's good salesmanship. You always want to get people to saying yes, and the more you can get them to say yes, the more they're going to agree with you.
So the important point, I think, I mean, so to be, an effective apologist, the best tactic to take, if you can do it, is to find common ground somewhere. Like we agree on something, even though we disagree on something else. So you don't want to be, completely antagonistic. You don't want to be completely hostile. And in some ways, you want to do those things while you maintain while you maintain integrity. You don't, want to lie. You don't want to sell your cause down the river. You don't want to compromise overly. You do want to be honest, and you do want to be truthful. And I think that here Aristides does that. What he says about Egyptian religion is true. It just doesn't fit very well into his rubric of the four races. So in many ways, it's a very effective, I think, a very effective apology.
So what does the emperor think about that? Did anything?
I'm sorry, what, Connie?
What is the emperor? He's addressing it to the emperor, right?
It's
So what
unknown.
happened? What the emperor said?
It's unknown what the emperor thought of it. According to Eusebius, so the basic fact is that until much later, really until about the time of the legalization of Christianity with the Edict of Toleration, which I think was in 314.
Yeah.
Up until that time, our sources are really, really very spotty. And also a lot of it relies on Eusebius, who was often inaccurate. And then a lot relies on simply oral tradition, which was passed down, which has huge gaps. So Eusebius says that because of both this letter, this apology, and an apology from someone named Quadratus, persecution was stopped in Athens, but it's not actually clear whether or not that's the case. It's also Eusebius, in terms of Quadratus, Eusebius talks about a letter from Julius Africanus to Quadratus, but Julius Africanus lived in the early 3rd century, which is much later than Quadratus supposedly lived. And nothing of Quadratus other than one sentence that Eusebius quotes has been preserved. Much of the early writings have been lost. It's only, in fact, accidentally that Aristides' apology was found in the last decade, the 19th century. So we don't know.
Yeah.
And we don't, all that's really known about Aristides is that he was a philosopher by training, that his quest for truth led him to accept Christianity, that he remained a philosopher, and that he lived in Athens. So we don't know anything about him other than that. We don't know when he was born. We don't know when he died. We don't know whether or not he was martyred. The only thing that, I mean, those are the only details of his life that we know about, and his apology was found.
So really, this apology that he did something good, right? Because if there's a changes that took place that you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it may have been effective. It was certainly wide. Eusebius is probably correct that it was widely read.
Yeah.
This is also the first surviving Christian apology,
Yeah.
so that makes it significant. And the way in which his audience, directly for the emperor, also to anyone interested in philosophy, and the way he sort of balances his argument is significant. So first of all, you notice that he begins with a defense of monotheism and a defense of a God who is immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, has no need of anything. All of those attributes of God are found in Stoic philosophy. So he's drawing on basically Stoic philosophy in his defense of monotheism. So he does that really well. And then he moves on to the critique of the religions of the four races plus the Egyptians, right? So the barbarians there's a certain intuitiveness to worshiping the elements, right? I mean, the earth is the earth. One has to, live by the products, the fruits of the earth. The sun is the sun. Without the sun, obviously, we die. Water is water. Without water, we die. So there's a certain intuitiveness to worshiping them as gods. For the Greek religions, there's no intuitiveness to it at all. And ultimately, what one is worshiping are the products of legend. And in the case of barbarians, there become to be representations of water, earth, sky, and whatever, and those things begin to be recognized as gods. And those things are the product of human hands. So,
Wait, they created things and locked it up in the temple and guard it,
right,
assuming
exactly.
that the robbers going to take them.
So those things themselves become powerless, are powerless,
Right, yeah.
except that they're not, because they actually have power over the people who worship them. So the thing that is made by human hands comes to dominate the person who made it. That's one of the tragedies of idolatry, that when people worship idols, the idol comes to have power over them, even though the idol itself is inanimate, has no real power. So, for example, worship of Mammon, right? For those who idolize Mammon, Mammon is in control of their lives. you can only serve one God, right? And if mammon is what you've elevated, even though mammon is not a god, and even though mammon isn't alive, and even though mammon itself has no real power, yet it comes to dominate those who worship it. It controls their lives, it rules over them. And that's really what's wrong with idolatry. It rules people and destroys them. And so we have the Egyptians also with their worship of animals, which Aristides sees as being very ridiculous. So does that sort of help?
Yes, it does.
To understand his argument and why he's arguing in the way he does?
You can tell he's really intelligent because of the organization of his arguments, so that we can make parallels in our mind with each successive group that he talks about, and then make comparisons, and then he knows how to build up to his point, as a good philosopher would. And makes it all, then when we get to Christians, logically Christians are the best because he's gone through all the faults and the reasons for the faults of the worshiping of the other religions.
What about his critique of Judaism?
That was interesting. Okay, where did I leave you?
He said most of the stuff that they believed, we believed also. That we were very similar.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few things.
He says his critique, his criticism is that nevertheless they too erred from true knowledge. And in their imagination they conceive that it is God they serve, whereas by their mode of observance it is to the angels and not to God that their service is rendered. As when they celebrate Sabbaths in the beginning of the months, and feasts of unleavened bread, and a great fast, and fasting and circumcision, and the purification of meats, which things, however, they do not observe perfectly. It's unclear what he means by angels, but what is his basic criticism? Ignore the angels part, which no one knows what he's really talking about.
Ron, doesn't it have mostly to do with Jesus is when our salvation?
Well, it does for Judaism not recognizing Jesus as Messiah. But what is his critique of, what is he trying to say that's wrong with Judaism?
They're not consistent.
Besides not recognizing the Messiah, or perhaps even why it didn't recognize the Messiah.
they get caught up in paying more attention to things like the Sabbath service and the way that they serve their meals, and the changing of the moons, and the fasting and their circumcision, all which are external things, instead of spending their time worshiping God. I hope I
Changing
understood.
of the moons is tied to the festivals, like the tabernacles. And,
Yeah, Sukkot and all of that.
so it's that it's concerned with ritual, and that ritual has obscured God.
Ritual and symbols.
Ritual and symbols have obscured God. And so that's a real danger. That's a danger it's a danger in Catholicism. In fact, that's a danger in Christianity as well, that ritual obscures God, that we become attached to ritual as a thing in itself and forget about God. And in fact, that's really the basis of Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees and the Jewish religious establishment, that they observe the law, but they interpret the law in a way that's favorable to them, what works for them. And they've forgotten that God is active. The law is this sort of dead set of precepts that one has to observe, but they've forgotten about the living God.
I have a question, Ron.
Uh-huh.
They mentioned that the Jews observe the cleanness of meat. What does that mean? Cleanness of meat. See, they observe the Sabbath, the fasting, the new moon, and cleanness of meat.
Oh, sure.
The unblemished,
Yeah, like
They don't eat
Animal?
pork or something. I don't know.
oh, yeah, it could be the like kosher meats.
Mm-hmm.
Pork was forbidden.
Yeah.
Well, of course,
Yeah.
in the hot climate, they had all the problems that they did with.
The trichinosis or whatever it is, yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
Mm.
and the purification of meats? Yeah, it's being kosher. So, meat has to be drained of blood, particularly since you can't eat blood, or, it's,
Yeah.
there's a major prohibition against eating blood or drinking blood of any sort. That's why in John's Gospel, when Jesus says that you have to eat his flesh and drink his blood,
Mhm.
many disciples leave him because he's clearly violating the Mosaic law in a very, or they interpret it as a violation of the Mosaic law in a very brazen and outrageous way, and so leave.
Yeah. I know in this century they cannot mix meat. It has a different refrigerator for meat and for the
Right.
other stuff.
For meat and dairy, or
Yeah.
yeah,
Lights and everything. It's always
Yeah,
separated.
even the dishes they
and
eat
the
off of.
dishes, right?
And
Right.
you,
Yeah. Even the
The-
countertop. The countertop they have to slice the meat in a different countertop, and the vegetable in a different countertop. So in the kitchen they actually have two kitchens, but
Mhm.
adjacent to each other but different countertops.
Yes, and the animal does have to be killed in a certain way because the blood can't contaminate the meat, even
Yeah.
though it's
Right.
out of.
That's hard.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think you slit the throat and it bleeds
Yes.
to death.
Yeah, the rabbis, I think, do a lot of the killing.
Yeah,
There's certain rabbis that do that are, just like some the rabbis do circumcisions, and they are trained for that. I grew up in a Jewish community with a lot of Jewish friends.
uh-huh. So what about the next question? Why does Aristides portray Christians as he does?
They're portrayed in the ideal, and maybe that's to make a stronger argument to the emperor.
What is his portrayal called?
I think he thinks that the Christian races was from Jesus Christ himself. And this one I read about that, it's like paraphrasing the creed. You know, I believe in God, but it's not in that context. It's a different wording, but I guess later it was changed, or some of the wording changed. But
Yeah,
most,
he
most
he
of the
has a
creed is in
creedal
there. Yeah,
he has a creedal formula. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But everything is there though. When you look at the creed now, and you look back on that, every single thing is in it. It's just
Uh-huh.
the wording.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's good. It is a creedal formula. So he portrays Christians in a very idealized way. Why is that?
Because that's the truth. The true God. God is good, according to that Christian. It's not like the other races.
It's good, but what about individual Christians? Why is he portraying them idealistically? What is that called?
Oh.
I don't remember the title, Ron, but I do know that he was speaking specifically about the fact that Christians had made a search through history and found the truth and learned from the writings, and they have a more genuine knowledge than the rest of the nations.
Uh-huh.
And then
Right.
he talks about all the amazing sort of a braggart approach to the fact that we treat people better, even those that persecute us.
Right. Uh-huh.
And
Right.
and we follow the rules of respect and courtesy to each other, and you know, if we see a stranger, we take them in.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Right.
And we share our food, and we don't judge, and we just
Right.
have a more enlightened approach to life and surviving with other races than the non-Christians do.
Uh-huh. Right. Right. And he also says that if somebody is suffering economically, then everyone fasts to set aside money or food for them, which suggests, you know, a general level of poverty of the community as a whole, but also, you know, an enormous spirit of generosity. So where does that all come from?
Christ's teachings.
From Christ's teachings, right? And so what he's talking about is the imitation of Christ, right? So as disciples of Christ, we're called to be imitators of Christ. And so we find that theme in the very earliest, I mean, that's a major theme of the Gospels, that we're to imitate Christ. We read the very earliest writings. If we read, I mean, the two earliest writings that are extant are St. Ignatius's 7 letters to one to St. Polycarp, and the remaining 6 to churches as he's going from Antioch to Rome for his execution. And he constantly writes about the imitation of Christ. He constantly writes about himself as being a living sacrifice and of joining his own sacrifice with that of Christ so that others may live. After his arrest, the persecution in Antioch ended. And so he rejoices that he's sacrificing his own life, but because of that, others will live. And so he'll join his sacrifice, that of Christ. Similarly, Pope St. Clement, in his letter to the Corinthians, focus was a great deal on the imitation of Christ. So that's a very constant theme that runs throughout Christian history and Christian thinking, that a Christian should, in some form, imitate Christ. That's something that in much of Christianity has been lost, which is very, which is very sad. Often when non-believers look at Christians, they see behavior that they don't possibly want to emulate because even by their own standards, it's sinful and disgusting. So that imitation of Christ is really very important, and also is a really substantial, obviously nobody's perfect and we all fall short of the glory of God, but it also is a reality, for many Christian communities. When we can contrast, say, the pandemic today with the plagues in the past. Here we have, churches that refuse to close because it's their right to worship. We have Christians who refuse to wear masks because they're covered by the blood of Jesus. And this kind of wanton selfishness and complete lack of concern for one's neighbor, much less love for one's neighbor. And so we contrast that with epidemics in the past, where in the pandemic in Carthage, Saint Cyprian sold the church's assets so that he could provide money and food for the poor. In the pandemics in the early church period through the Middle Ages, when there were pandemics, when most people were fleeing and trying to survive, Christians cared for the sick and the dying, and often themselves died, including cared for people who they didn't know. It wasn't their families. They cared for whomever was in need of care out of a spirit of compassion and love for one's neighbor. So that imitation of Christ is a really important thing. It's something that we should all be striving to do. It's something that really is required of any disciple of our Lord. So, the basic criticism levied against Christians is that because of them, the gods are displeased and everything is falling apart. And Aristides very neatly stands that on its head and reverses it and says it's because of Christians, things are being held together in the way that they are. That line of argument actually is followed by many of the church fathers who when it's pointed out to them, but look at all of the evil that's in the world, responded by saying, well, just think of how much evil there would be in the world if we weren't here. So we just pray that that continues to be true and that we ourselves are not contributors to evil. So we're about out of time. Are there thoughts or questions or comments, or was this, I guess we left out the final question. Did anyone, was this enjoyable? Did anyone find it compelling? Is it thought-provoking? Or was it just boring?
I thought I wouldn't get a lot out of it, but I found this really edifying, and I learned a lot. It was, and I like learning.
Good.
A lot of information.
Uh-huh.
Really good. It's not boring, Ron. It's really good. Looking
Good.
forward to the next one.
It's just, you have to read really slowly because there are lots of details in every sentence.
Uh-huh.
Well, some of them are very redundant. Just, repeating.
Yeah, there's an element of redundancy.
Right, yeah.
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 And I have no idea how you remember all those names.
I can't even pronounce it, let alone remember it.
Well, since we don't worship Greek gods or the Egyptian
lucky.
gods, or
The only thing I know is Zeus and Aphrodite.
yeah, I think Mars was in there as well, and Pluto was, and a
Hera,
few-
I think Hera.
yeah,
Well, yeah, that's great though. Really enjoy that.
Yeah.
okay.
So
So
what
Oh,
was the
don't
other
forget to send us the question.
Yeah,
Don't forget to send us the question next time.
ahead of time.
yeah, I'll send you questions ahead of time. Next week we'll discuss atheism and the existence of God.
Ron, is next week the confirmation class? Mass?
No, I think it
Not
was
today,
tonight. I think it was tonight.
tonight. It just got
Yeah.
over. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know.
You're gonna give us the link, Ron? You said you're gonna give us another link.
Was there another website we could have checked on?
Yeah, that's what you said a while ago.
Yeah, the
Email it to us, Ron.
yeah, I'll email.
Okay.
The for next week there's a Bishop Barron video on YouTube to watch, and a couple of two readings, I think, and also a reading to read the 119th Psalm.
119.
Yeah, Aristides implicitly on it here, and so does some atheist analysis is based on the 119th Psalm. So, and we'll sort of briefly discuss the problem of evil, although we'll save most of that discussion to our very last class. So sort of atheism and agnosticism will blanket our class, be at the beginning and end, and in between we'll largely focus on partly on Protestantism or principles, tenets common to Protestantism, especially on beliefs common to evangelical fundamentalism, which has become the predominant form of Protestantism in America today. So I'll send out the links to next week's readings and viewing.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
And and I'll put the video from today up on YouTube. After I forgot to turn the recording back on immediately after we came out after the breakout groups ended. So some stuff is missing.
That's okay.
So was the breakout group useful or not?
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, we did. I didn't have enough time.
Yeah.
No, we ran out of time.
You didn't have time?
Well, for some reason, when you switched us into groups, when I hit like join, I was thrown out. So might be my system. And so same thing coming back in. So it takes me a while to get back in again.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why that was. So next week we'll do a little bit with the problem of evil. We'll also a major criticism of atheists and agnostics is that as Christians we're opposed to science and reject science, and so Christianity becomes, a set of basically narrow-minded, bigoted, anti-scientific beliefs. So that's something that we want to, look at very carefully and discuss.
And will you be talking about, to me, it doesn't seem like that anymore. And it seems like something back in the time of the book, The Sleepwalkers, about, all that happened with astronomers and everything. And, but I would really like to know if atheists still think that we don't believe in science as Christians.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, it's not true with Catholicism, but it's certainly, we see it, today. Well, we see it in the midst of this pandemic, that
Yes,
the
yeah,
folks
except
that you don't need to wear masks, that you don't need to do anything, that, and we also see it with global warming, that God will protect us, that, this is a problem of forest management. The denial of science, particularly by evangelicals,
yes.
is shocking and
Yeah.
embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem is, that we get painted with the same brush.
Yeah.
There's, which is, sort of common. Much of the criticism leveled by evangelicals at us as Catholics is criticism that applies to all of the pre-Reformation churches. And so it's not only Catholicism that believes in the real presence. Catholicism is unique in developing a philosophy, transubstantiation, to explain it. And in all of the other pre-Reformation churches, it's the mystery of Christ's presence. And there's no attempt to explain it, but there's a very real belief that Christ is present in the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the basis of Mass, and through the Eucharist is a medium for us to join our sacrifice with Christ, and so receive an outpouring of God's grace. So that basic theology is common to the Greek Orthodox Church, to the Nestorian Church, to the Coptic Church, to the Abyssinian Church, to the Ethiopian Church, to the Syriac Church, and to the Armenian Church. So all of those agree. So it's not only us, but by making it us, it basically abstracts the Catholic Church from history and sets us up to be villains.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So with that, we can stop. I'll stop the recording.
Thank you.